Thanks for coming out tonight. I've got lots of information for you all, but I'm also happy to take questions throughout. As Nayla mentioned, my background is as an environmental attorney, but I've worked in wolf conservation for well over a decade in both the Rockies and the Pacific West. I'm going to focus my presentation today on wolves in Oregon, but I'm happy to answer questions about the region. So as Nayla mentioned, I grew up between Ashland and Klamath Falls in what is now an inholding in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. Wolves have gotten pretty close to where I grew up, but they're not quite there yet. Journey came pretty close, actually. And my dad's still there, and I go down pretty often to visit him. But I have only seen wolves in Wyoming and Montana, maybe Idaho, over the years. So I'm going to talk about the history of wolves in Oregon, how we got to where we are today, what the numbers look like, and if folks are interested, I can also give you a legal timeline, which are kind of at the end of my presentation. So again, please raise a hand, let me know if you have questions throughout, and we'll definitely have time for questions at the end. What I will say is, so I work for Cascadia Wildlands, which is a regional conservation organization. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. We were founded as a result of the forest defense movement, and we primarily work to protect and restore Cascadia's wild ecosystems in the forests, in the courts, and in the streets. We're based in Eugene, but work throughout the bioregion. As Nayla also mentioned, I have been a member of the Pacific Wolf Coalition for many years, and recently just ended my second term on the steering committee. I've brought some fun stickers at the back for both the coalition and for Cascadia, so help yourself. The last known wolf was killed in Oregon in 1947. Most of them were gone earlier in the 40s. That was a concerted extermination effort, largely conducted by the government. There were bounties, there was wide-scale poisoning, and there was just, we thought it was okay to just eliminate whole species from ecosystems. So we know that that was the last one killed in Oregon, but they were mostly gone before then. Then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed. That law received nearly unanimous support from Congress. This was an era when conservation was not necessarily partisan. This is a strange thing, but Richard Nixon's signing statement of the Endangered Species Act is a really beautiful piece of writing. And 93 senators voted for the Endangered Species Act. In the early days of the Endangered Species Act, there were not critical habitat designations. That was a piece of the law that was added later. So wolves do not actually have designated critical habitat because they were one of the very first species, along with grizzly bears, that were added to the list of threatened and endangered species. And wolves have largely been protected under the ESA since then, although I will explain why we have a very strange situation in Oregon, where in part of the state, wolves continue to have ESA protections, and in other parts, they do not. That's an entirely political outcome, not one based on science. So in 1999, when I was a senior in high school in Ashland, the first wolf was videotaped swimming across the river from Idaho into Oregon. That wolf did not stick around, sadly. But in anticipation of wolves' natural return to Oregon, conservation organizations, including Cascadia Wildlands, among others, started to work with the state to adopt a wolf plan. Like, let's talk about what the plan is for when these critters come back to our state. And that took many years. And in 2005, the first version of the wolf plan was adopted. And that was actually the first state wolf plan. So Oregon was like the model. Then in 2008, wolves came and they stayed. And that was the first established pact in Oregon. In 2011, in anticipation of potential conflict with the livestock industry, Oregon adopted a program that is a livestock loss compensation fund, under which livestock producers, if the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife determines that it was indeed a wolf who is responsible for loss of livestock, confirmed or probable loss, they are compensated at full market value for that loss. Yes?
Did the first pack come by itself?
Yes. So it's a myth that wolves were reintroduced into Oregon. Wolves were reintroduced in 1994 and 1995 to Yellowstone National Park and the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in Idaho. And those wolves, over time, reproduced and expanded their habitat. And wolves will naturally, usually young males, but occasionally young females, will leave their natal pack, the pack they were born into when they're about 2, and they will go looking for a new habitat, and they will go looking for a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And so that's what naturally happened, is that wolves expanded from those 2 reintroduction sites. In Yellowstone, they were concerned that the wolves might turn around and run back to Canada because those wolves came from Canada. They're the same species. It is a myth that they are giant Canadian wolves. They are the same species of wolf, exactly the same, because wolves don't recognize political boundaries. So the wolves in Canada are the same species of the wolves in the lower 48, except for Mexican wolves, which are a subspecies that exist in the Southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico and in Mexico. And then we have the red wolf in North Carolina, which is the most critically imperiled wolf species. There's only a few dozen left in the wild, which is a whole other ball of wax. So wolves who descended from the wolves that were reintroduced to Yellowstone, the wolves that were brought into Yellowstone were actually put in a containment pen. You can go to Yellowstone and hike or snowshoe to that location in the park. I have done that. It's a very cool thing to do. And they were very secretly brought roadkill to help sustain them as they got used to being in the park. And there's a great book about that called Decade of the Wolf, which is about the first 10 years of the wolf reintroduction program. And the biologists who went and collected all this roadkill and hiked it in on their shoulders to help these wolves in this containment pen that's above the Buffalo Ranch in the Lamar Valley. So you can go and visit that if you would like to. There's still some remnant of where they were. In the Frank Church, they just let them loose, darted them, released them, and they went loose in the wilds of Idaho. So the descendants of those wolves over time moved slowly west and arrived in Oregon. And so all of our wolves are the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the wolves that were reintroduced into Yellowstone and the Frank Church in Idaho. So in 2011, the compensation fund was established with the support of most conservation organizations, and we still have that system today. And in that same year, OR7 or Journey, there was a naming competition that Oregon Wild sponsored, and kids voted and chose that name. So Journey was the first wolf who entered Western Oregon, and he roamed all over the place looking for a lady, including near my backyard where I grew up, into Northern California. So he became the first wolf back in California in nearly a century. And then came back north and was like, oh, Crater Lake's kind of cool, maybe I'll hang out there. And he met a lady, a black wolf, who had actually crossed over Mount Hood and come south. And they liked each other and had pups, and they became the Rogue Pack, which is the first pack that established in Western Oregon. And the Rogue Pack still exists. It's just a couple individuals, but the descendants of Journey are still there. And there are some new packs in California that they've done some genetic testing and have discovered that they are Journey's grandchildren who have made their way to California. So in 2015, we hit a major milestone, which was that Oregon's wolf population reached 100. And then this year, which I will tell you was a surprise because the news had not been great for about 5 years, we got over 200. So the last 2 years, our population had stagnated at 178. It was 173, and then 175, and then 178, and then last year 178 again. And we were pretty worried about that tapering off. And this year we had this nice bump from 178 to 204. Yeah?
Another quick one. What is the time-wise, in summary, what is the life cycle time-wise for the mate finding, once they find a mate the kids, how long do the pups have to go? How long do they, before they can get out and start getting around? And then when do they switch?
Sure. So the question was kind of the life cycle of a wolf and how long it takes how old you are when you go looking for a partner and then have pups and how long those pups take. So generally a wolf stays with their natal pack through their first year, usually into their second. They might stay in that pack forever. If they decide to go adventuring, it's usually in the 2 to 3 age. And then they generally mate in about February and they den in April. And then those pups are born in the spring, so right about now is when pups are being born. Survival rates are pretty low, usually less than 50%. So the reason that we talk about a minimum wolf population is that we just count, and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife goes out and counts, and they do that through aerial surveys. And they do it in the winter because it's easier to look for wolves in the snow because they can see packs, and they often do it from the air. And they have collars, radio collars on at least 1 or 2 individuals of a lot of these packs. So they use the collar data to go looking for them, and then they count wolves from the plains, from the air. But they do that at that time of year also because if a pup that was born in April or May has survived till December, they're probably going to go survive. So we don't count pups when they're born because there's a pretty low survival rate. But if they make it all the way to December, then they're probably okay. And that's how we establish our minimum wolf count. So we know this year there's a minimum of 204 wolves. We're not saying there's exactly 204 wolves because there's probably some we don't know about. But that's our minimum population. And that's how Oregon has always counted its wolves, so that you can compare it over time. Because if we change our methodology, then it's hard to compare year to year. I wanted to just show, we talk about Pacific wolves because they are fairly geographically isolated from other populations. The current distribution is in orange. I will tell you that map is actually from before we got the 2024 data, because that data is exactly a week old and we have not updated this map, but the numbers are current. So while Oregon's information is positive this year, Washington's population actually decreased. And we actually think some of that is that last year's count was inaccurate, and we think it was overblown, and there's a lot we could say about that, but I'll leave it at that. So Washington's minimum wolf population is about 230 wolves. That's kind of where they are. The green is identified potential, currently available habitat, not historic habitat, because basically all of this area is historic habitat. That's habitat that is currently identified as good habitat for wolves. And then the orange is where they are. Both Washington and Oregon do their population estimates annually at the end of the calendar year. California updates more frequently. Part of that is weather differences. Part of that is just how their department talks about it. So California's population has been increasing, and you'll notice this little orange blob way far south, which was a really big surprise. People were like, you gotta be kidding, but they made it all the way down there, which is pretty neat, and they're pretty far away from their cousins up north. So the last update we got from California was in June. We just got our numbers in the last week and a half for Washington and Oregon. So this is the current pack distribution map as of December 31st, but released last week. That's always how they do it. We get the data in April. And so the orange, they call them areas of known wolf activity, aquas. And they say, okay, we know there's wolves around. And they draw maps of basically where the wolves are. So you can see most of them are in northeast Oregon. That's because they moved their way in from Idaho and also potentially Montana and Wyoming. This map is in the wolf report, which came out last week, which is available online from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, so you can easily Google that. I just exported the map from their report, and you can compare it to previous years. So where we are here in Lane County, we have kind of the potential of 2 packs The indigo has had a rough go, and Christina can tell you more about that. That pack has unfortunately been habituated to humans, and so we've lost one that was hit by a car and the one that was shot in the last few years. We've also got upper Deschutes, and we'll talk some more about the Metolius pack outside of Sisters. Gerhardt Mountain has been a victim of poaching by poisoning, so there's definitely some impacts, and so some of it is like we know they're there, and some of it is an estimate. So the rogue has been kind of a question mark about whether there's still a pack or not in the last few years.
Are those the names of the?
Those are the names, yep. And they're usually named after landmarks. So Rogue was named after Rogue River or the Rogue Basin. Gerhardt Mountain Pack is named after Gerhardt Mountain. Sometimes it's a mountain range, sometimes it's a valley. So you can see, White River, Warm Springs is named after the reservation. So that's often how they are given their pack names. Yeah.
So is the red line protected?
Right. So I'm going to get to that in a future slide, but yes. So the red line is our weird artificial political boundary about where wolves have Endangered Species Act designation and where they do not. So west of Highway 395, Highway 20, Highway 97, they are protected federally by the Endangered Species Act, which means it is a federal crime to kill, wound, harm, harass a wolf in that area. And then east of that, they do not have that federal protection. I'm happy to explain it. It's super wonky, but I can explain how we ended up in that situation. And then wolves are managed on the state level and in the eastern. It's really more like 2/3 and 1/3 in terms of total area. It's not half and half. They are, oh, you know what? I just totally misspoke. The red line is the state management zone. Sorry, so western and eastern. So the red line in the west is what the state of Oregon calls western management zone and eastern management zone. And the blue line, that's the 2/3 and 1/3, is the federal listing boundary. So that's quite a bit more east. Sorry about that misspeaking. So let me get into that a little more. So the Oregon Wolf Plan has 3 phases. And you don't want to set recovery goals based on total population, because just like humans, the total number of people doesn't really tell you whether they can reproduce, right? So that you need to look at the total effective population, which means the population that can still contribute to the population moving forward. So we talk about breeding pairs, and packs over time as how to measure the success. So the western zone remains in phase 1. It would require a certain number of breeding pairs for 3 years to move from phase 1 to phase 2 and then into phase 3. We were close to moving into phase 2 because we'd had 2 years of more than 3 breeding pairs. And then in the last days of 2023, someone poisoned the Gerhardt Mountain Pack near Chiloquin, and the breeding pair was killed along with a 3rd wolf, and that led to there not being enough breeding pairs last year, and that restarts the clock. The good news about the report this year is that we had 7 breeding pairs in the west, which was a big jump, so that's great, except since they counted, we've already had one of those wolves poached. So we will wait and see next year whether that has set things back or whether there's still enough to move. And if they stayed at 7 or more, they could actually jump phase 2 into phase 3 directly. But again, we've already lost the Metolius breeding male, was killed in March outside of Sisters. We don't know how he was killed. They have not revealed that information. And there is a very significant reward available for information that leads to an arrest or charge for that. And in that area, it is both a state and a federal crime. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement is leading that investigation because of where it happened. So the eastern zone has been in phase 3 for many years, and that allows for some more liberalized management to occur. And all this information is available online in the Oregon Wolf Plan, which requires an update every 5 years. And the last time it was updated was in December of 2023, and they effectively didn't really update it, which was frustrating to us because we said, well, at least add all the new science. And they were like, science. But we were also a little worried it might get worse, and so we didn't make too much of a fuss about them not totally opening up the wolf plan for revision. So again, the light green is where it's under totally state control. The dark blue is where we're in phase 2 of the wolf plan, and the green as well, and in the eastern portion of the state, and then the light blue is the western wolf management zone. So we're obviously in the western management zone. So do folks want to know the background of how we ended up with this weird situation? So the Endangered Species Act, whole species are listed, or what are called distinct population segments, which is a term of art in the law. The idea behind a distinct population segment is that you could list less than the whole species if they were geographically or genetically isolated. So when you have a species that historically had a huge range, like most of the entire United States, it might be that in some areas that species is doing all right, but in other areas where it's potentially genetically isolated or isolated by geography, like really high mountain range or something like that, that distinct population segment itself might need protections. And so under the listing for the Endangered Species Act, they listed what was at the time called the Northern Rockies Distinct Population Segment, because wolves were not back in the entire country. They were in these few areas. So there was an isolated population in the Great Lakes. There's a population in Alaska that is not protected under the law, which is obviously geographically isolated. And then there was this population in the Northern Rockies. And they drew a bubble around where those wolves were at that time. And that bubble included the eastern third of Oregon and the eastern third of Washington and this tiny weird little section of northwest Nevada, and a little bit blip of Utah, and then Wyoming and Montana and Idaho. And that was the geographic boundary, because at the time that was the boundary of where wolves existed. Well, the thing is, that's not a static thing, right? So wolves over time started to recover, they started to move west, and so that was a fiction that was created by the listing in the law. So in 2011, there had been an effort to remove protections for wolves in the Rockies. There were lawsuits that said, hang on, we haven't reached the scientific recovery thresholds. That decision by the agency was overturned. But then in 2011, when it was awfully important for John Tester to keep his Senate seat in Montana, there was an effort for the first time ever under the Endangered Species Act to congressionally remove a species, not based on the science, not through the process outlined in the law, but via politics, to strip a species of protection under the law. The law had been on the books for 40 years by then, and that had never happened. But that's what Congress did. They said, we're stripping protection, science be damned. We want to keep this seat blue in Montana. And that was really what was behind it. And that was challenged in court, and then we run into this problem of the separation of powers, and the court said, well, Congress gets to do its thing, and you don't get to challenge what Congress did here. And so even though the science didn't support it, that was the outcome. So in 2012 or in 2011, that portion of Oregon and Washington lost federal protections. Under the Biden administration, there were actually efforts, conservation groups re-petitioned for listing and said, you got to give protections back. And those decisions are actually still pending, but that's a little tricky. And we are currently facing a proposal to remove protections for wolves nationally at the federal level. Rep. Boebert from Colorado is sponsoring that bill, and there was a hearing on that bill a couple weeks ago in the House. So we have this very strange, not based in science, based in these arbitrary political boundaries that they drew along highways, which wolves don't really understand. That's where we got where we were. And then what's not great is that Oregon kind of paralleled that. So wolves were protected under the State Endangered Species Act in Oregon. It's not a particularly strong law, but it's better than nothing. And then the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife was like, we don't really want to deal with this species being protected anymore. And they moved to remove protections. And Cascadia, along with other groups, sued and said, hang on, that's not what the science supports. And that was moving along. And then the legislature stepped in and was like, yeah, we're done. And legislatively delisted, and the court said, you don't get to challenge that. So we had the same thing happen in Oregon. So the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife manages wolves, but they don't have State Endangered Species Act protections, and they don't have federal protections. But under the wolf plan, they're not recovered enough for them to have considered yet like hunting or trapping seasons or anything like that. So it remains illegal everywhere, except for under very specific circumstances, to kill a wolf in Oregon. And in the western 2/3 of the state, it's a federal and a state crime, and in the eastern third, it's only a state crime. So this just shows you the trend line over time of population growth, and it shows both the minimum count, which is a total number, which again is not the best measure for population health, because it includes the oldest wolves and the youngest wolves. And then on the right, it includes breeding pairs and packs, which is a better measure for how they're doing and whether they're likely to reproduce. And what you can see is that kind of worrisome trend there between like 2019 and 2023, where it basically plateaued. That undermined ODF&W's justification for removing protections, because their assumption is that at a minimum we'd see a 6% population increase over time, and that was not happening, and that was very worrisome. And part of why that's not happening is there's poaching epidemic, and there's pretty aggressive agency authorized killings, and then there's some questionable other forms of killing that happens as well. And we'll talk a little more about that. So this year is particularly good news, but before that we've been pretty worried. And then the thing that's concerning, and this tells you that again, you don't want to base it just on the total population number, is that we've got this kind of wiggly line for packs, but the breeding pairs are decreasing, and the breeding pairs are definitely decreasing in Eastern Oregon, and that's worrisome. Now, it is possible that in some areas they're just reaching the carrying capacity for the habitat, and that's totally valid, but there's still quite a bit of unoccupied habitat, and if you have too many killed before they can move to unoccupied habitat, then we get this situation where we have a plateau in the population. Yeah?
Temperature-wise, it looks to me like the wolves kind of go for the snow in the cold areas. And so how is climate impacting on this?
Yeah, so wolves are habitat generalists, so they don't care that much about like snow and other things. They're interested in prey base, so they're looking for deer and elk, and other factors like that. Snow can be hard on them, but obviously they thrive in Yellowstone. But generally in Yellowstone, they stay up north in the Lamar Valley where there's a lot of elk. And then a few packs have learned how to hunt bison, but it's like a learned behavior, and it's very specialized, like the Molly's pack. And they literally have figured out that these wolves are so smart that they have different roles when they're hunting. So there's like the wolf that goes for the snout and the wolf that's in the back. Like they're very, very smart animals. But most wolf packs don't hunt bison. They're almost all elk and deer, a little bit of pronghorn. And then we don't have bison in Oregon. And we don't have a lot of moose or anything else, so it's mostly mule deer and elk, potentially some whitetail. So it really has more to do with prey. And then, roads are a barrier. And each year we have a couple wolves that are killed by cars. So we also need more wildlife crossings, and there's current effort. Oregon has very few. We only have 3. One, Senators Merkley and Wyden ensured funding for one just right near where I grew up, south of Ashland on Siskiyou Pass. They're going to put a crossing in, which is really awesome. It's federally funded, and there's an effort at the legislature this year to have Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Transportation talk a whole lot more about where there are places, because it's also a huge issue for safety and expense, mostly around deer vehicle strikes, but like 4,500 a year in Oregon, and that's a lot of vehicle damage, it's a lot of insurance expense, it's a lot of potential for injury, it's a lot of injured and killed animals too. But wildlife crossings are a really great thing for wolves as well. Yep.
I'm not saying there is a connection, but that curve that you described, I think pandemic at that time period. Is there any connection at all?
Not that I'm aware of, but we were curious this year about how the fires in Northeast Oregon might impact the population. And I will talk more about what led to that. And it was a huge increase in poaching and agency authorized killing that led to that. So human caused death. So this is a grouse flats pack wolf. One of the things that's fun about ODF&W is they have a link to like a Flickr account, and they update it with new camera trap photos of wolves. So this is a recent photo of a Oregon wolf. Looks like a juvie to me. I asked my colleague from the International Wolf Center, but that's a juvie wolf. That's not a full-grown wolf. And actually, I saw a post. So we have a group that has a very similar name called Cascadia Wild that does wildlife tracking on Mount Hood. And they posted today about their first ever like full face shot wolf camera trap shot on Mount Hood. And there's a new pack that's been hanging out on Mount Hood, and it's a black wolf like this too, which is pretty cool. Like I mentioned, so the three main threats to wolves are poaching, pretty liberal agency authorized killings, and actually I put 4 on here. There's the looming threat of premature removal of federal protections, and then anti-wolf rhetoric and myth. So unfortunately, Oregon's poaching problem is pretty significant. It is illegal to kill a wolf. We have for many years, both the conservation community, also the agencies, and through the Oregon TIP, Turn-In Poachers Fund. So we work with the Oregon Hunters Association and the Oregon State Police and others to have a standing reward when poaching has happened. And there is just a cone of silence around wolf poaching. It is quite successful with lots of other species. So for example, recently somebody said, my neighbor killed this bobcat, and we paid that reward, or owls or other species. So we have brought lots of folks to justice around it, and it really is a theft of a resource that belongs to all of us. It has been particularly tricky when it comes to wolves. We have literally like hundreds of thousands of dollars of rewards that are currently pending, and that hasn't worked. And the federal government for the Metolius pack is offering $10,000. We've more than matched that, and I don't know yet whether that's going to lead to anything. But in 2023, at least 12 wolves were poached, which is really high. This year, that number is 7, which is better, but it's still way too many. And one of the really concerning trends, and this is something I struggle with as a conservationist, we used to always send press releases and yell about it, and we've gotten a lot quieter because the last thing we want to do is like tell people how to kill wolves. And a lot of them now are by poison. So it used to almost always be a wolf was shot. Usually what happens is that it was a collared wolf. And so then the agency gets a death signal. So the wolf stops moving and the collar sends out a signal. And there's 2 different types of collars, so how quickly that happens. And then the agency goes and looks, and then they often find other wolves as well. So that's what happened with the Gerhardt Mountain that were poisoned. Last year, I believe it happened in February, they got a death signal from a collar way out in the John Day area in the Hells Canyon Recreation area. And so they flew over, and it was total carnage. It turned out someone had brought in poison and poisoned a cow carcass, and that had attracted wolves, and it killed 3 wolves. It killed a mountain lion. It killed several golden eagles, which is a federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act violation, and a bald and golden eagle Protection Act violation, so it was a federal crime. Coyotes, magpies, ravens, just a ton of death. and it was in a creek. And so that's a Clean Water Act violation. And ODFW had to call DEQ and say, how do we keep our staff safe? And they had to wear like hazmat suits to try to figure out how to get this poisoned giant cow carcass out of this creek in the middle of the winter that was posing this huge threat to the environment. ODFW has subsequently told us, we didn't realize how bad it was. We now think that basically every unexplained wolf death was probably poisoning, and that's been true for a while. And that there's probably lots we don't know about, because really just what happens is if people find it or the caller gives off that death signal and then they go out looking. One of the poachings this year or last year was they just found the caller and the wolf is missing. And so we don't know how that wolf died, but we know that wolf is no longer with us. We have not been told how the Metolius pack wolf was killed. And that's legitimate. That's a law enforcement strategy, right? They're keeping some things close to the vest to try to learn. But Oregon State Police officer at the wolf plan revision meeting a year and a half ago just said, it's probably, sometimes it might be grandpa's DDT that's still in the barn. There's a lot of folks in rural areas that have like pretty intensely dangerous substances that are there. It poses a huge risk to the environment, to other wildlife, to carrion species who might come and eat a carcass. And we've had several incidences of dogs who were killed, and ODFW thinks that those folks were probably targeting wolves. So it's a very serious problem, and we are not succeeding in getting it under control. ODFW has tried to do a big public outreach campaign. They did radio ads, and they posted signage at trailheads after that incident in February. But we have had a couple of these mass poisonings, and it's also happening in Washington State. So it's very worrisome. And it could hurt a person too if they got into that, and the water bodies. So pretty serious. You can read more about it. There's photographs of that. ODFW put out a big press release about that event that occurred around John Day. Under the wolf plan in phase 3, ODFW can also authorize wolves to be killed who are predating on livestock. Wolves are like teenagers, right? So, if there's like easy food, they might be interested in that easy food. Hunting's hard, making dinner's hard. There's a lot of non-lethal coexistence tools that you can use to deter that from happening. There's also a lot of livestock on the landscape without a lot of supervision. And a lot of what can often happen is a lot of those animals will die based on weather or disease, and then that carcass is on the landscape and it is an attractant to wolves because they are scavengers. That happened recently in Southern Oregon where there was a very heavy snowstorm and a lot of livestock died. Sometimes it'll even be as much as like there's snow and then it melts and then it freezes and they literally get frozen to the ground. It's a problem. So there was a ton of carcasses and that created this big attractant and it brought some wolves in. And I'll talk about some stats around that in a few minutes. But if ODFW determines, yes, there's a wolf that's been predating, we have done an investigation, it's a wolf or it's probably a wolf, and they will look at the collar data and the known area of wolf activity and they'll say, okay, we think it's this pack, and they may issue a kill permit for a certain amount of time. And that either the agency can go out or an agent of the agency. They often contract with the federal, very ironically named Wildlife Services program, which used to be called Animal Damage Control, which is a much more honest name for that program. They will come out, or the producer can kill that wolf. And there is a provision that allows for caught in the act. So if a rancher actually finds a wolf like actively predating, they are allowed to kill that wolf. So last year we had three I think, I'll have that stat in a minute, who were caught in the act killings, and then a dozen authorized killings. And the agency will often conduct that with our taxpayer dollars, sometimes by aerially gunning them, which is incredibly expensive and cruel, and puts a lot of lead into the environment. And then we are worried about premature removal and wholesale attacks on the Endangered Species Act. So last week, the Trump administration put out a proposal to remove all like habitat protections for threatened and endangered species. That wouldn't actually impact wolves because wolves don't have the critical habitat provision, but it would species like the spotted owl and the marbled murrelet and all sorts of other species. We're currently in a 30-day public comment period on that proposal, but it would fundamentally change. They want to change the definition of harm to not include adverse modification or destruction of critical habitat, and that would be very bad. And then there's this effort to like remove individual animals from the list, which is a terrible precedent. Didn't happen before 2011, and we've been fighting it ever since. And we'll see if there's a wholesale repeal effort. That hasn't happened quite yet, but we shall see. And then there's a lot of history, right? Like, I mean, I really like the band Rising Appalachia, and they have this great song about activism, but it even says like wolves howling at the door as a bad thing, and I'm like, I wish you would change that one line of this song. And it's prominent in like Catholic history, and obviously like Little Red Riding Hood, right? So we were all socially conditioned to be afraid of wolves. You are orders of magnitude more likely to be struck by lightning or killed by a vending machine than you are to be injured by a wolf, literally. There are 2 known incidences of a human being killed by a wolf in North America, and both of those are questionable. There's a lot of thought that it wasn't actually a wolf. It is just extremely unlikely. And all you really need to do when you think about that is, right, like I have spent a lot of time watching wolves in Yellowstone, and they are not interested in me, right? They are much more interested in what they're gonna eat. It is just extremely unlikely that you would ever have a negative encounter with wolf. I've never had a negative encounter with wolf. I have sought out lots of encounters with wolves. They are very family oriented. They're territorial. Actually, one of the biggest impacts to wolves in Yellowstone is being killed by other packs. They kill each other more than lots of other causes of death for wolves. So we have lots to do to just dispel that mythology. Same thing, you're more likely to be injured by a cougar or a bear, but you're still super unlikely, any of these predator species, super, super unlikely to have a negative interaction. And with bears, it's almost always because you got between a mama and her cubs. And I think all the mamas in the room probably understand that one. Sorry about the text heavy slide, but I just did want to place us in reality. So wolves have been back in Oregon since '99 and established since 2008. In that entire time, 535 animals have been killed by wolves, livestock animals. So we have over 1.3 million cows and sheep in Oregon. That's a lot of critters, right? So the percentage is not remotely statistically significant. 0.00067% of Oregon's livestock are killed by wolves in a given year. It is a tiny, tiny percentage. It does not show up in the reporting by the US Department of Agriculture because it's such a tiny percentage. Huge amounts of those animals are killed by weather and by disease. And then USDA has a category for predation, and they don't even break out wolves because wolves are such a tiny percentage of the whole category of predation. It's a bigger issue with eagles and buzzards because they'll come after lambs right after they're born. They're smart. In fact, I saw an eagle in a lamb field driving between Salem and Eugene when I was at the legislative session recently. And coyotes are way more likely to be a problem. Last year, predation incidents were down, which is great, even though wolf population increased. So it's not a direct correlation between population and predation. And the total number of animals, it's often just like one animal when we're talking about a cow or a livestock guardian dog, but with sheep, it'll often be several. So that's the total number. There are fewer total incidents. We've never had 100 or more incidents of predation in a given year in Oregon, ever. Which doesn't mean it's not significant to a livestock producer when it happens. It obviously is when it happens to them as an individual. But it is not a chronic, nor is it a significant piece of the hardships that folks who are producing livestock are experiencing. Climate change, drought, market fluctuations, lack of young folks who want to work on the range, hard time staffing your outfit. Those are much more significant challenges to these folks than wolves or all predators on the landscape. So this is just, I'm not going to read it all to you, but these are those stats of like the mortality numbers, how many wolves we had, how many were killed in a year, how many of those were human caused, how many were we killed on purpose, both either the agency itself or by poaching. And you can see that like it's a really significantly high percentage of human caused mortalities each year. And it's the biggest single threat to our population staying viable and certainly growing. So this last year, we had 22 of the, I think it was 26 total, sorry I don't have that on there. 22 of those deaths were human caused, 14 were the agency allowed, 3 of those were caught in the act, 11 were targeted, 7 at least, that's a minimum number, poached, 1 hit by a car. One year we had 1 hit by a boat. So that's some of this number I just went over, but it is a problem going forward. I do want to note that last year, and this is part of the reason that we had the plateau, we sent 10 wolves to Colorado to help them in their wolf recovery. Colorado has the most unoccupied wolf habitat of any state in the country, and Coloradans voted by ballot initiative to reintroduce wolves. And when that effort started, I lived in Colorado and worked on it a little bit. Unfortunately, a couple of those wolves have already been killed. Wolves do not recognize arbitrary state boundaries, so they have wandered into Wyoming and been immediately killed. And Oregon was the only state that stepped up to send wolves. It's pretty funny because Montana and Idaho and Wyoming don't really like their wolves, but they refuse to send any to Colorado. They're killing them very liberally. They refuse to share any with Colorado. So this year, BC sent wolves to Colorado in the second year of the reintroduction effort in Colorado. Yeah.
So it looked like from your last slide that ODF is killing off between 14 and 16 a year.
The last couple years. Yep.
I didn't see anything over 16.
Right. Yeah.
Any of it.
Right.
But do they have a limit as to how many they can authorize to be killed?
So they do not have a limit in statute or regulation. I do think they pay attention because they don't want to see a decline in the population. But the year they did 16 was like twice what they'd done previously, and that was a pretty serious management shift. And the thing we talk to them about all the time is like, how do we focus on prevention of the conflict instead of this kind of knee-jerk responsiveness? It is a hard job to be an ODF&W biologist with some angry ranchers in rural Oregon, and they have had a hard time keeping staff on board. They have pretty high turnover in those positions. It's part of why they contract with Wildlife Services to do some of the work. So it's sticky. What we have found is, so there's a whole suite of coexistence tools. We think one of the very best ones is just human presence. So we refer to that as range riding, but you need to do the right kind of range riding. So like any tool, right? If you never sharpen your lawnmower blades or you never buy new string for your weed whacker, like it doesn't work anymore, right? Same thing, my dad's always sharpening his chainsaw, right? If you don't have the right file. So same thing with range riding. You need to be out at dawn and dusk, which is when wolves are most active. You need to be on the range where your livestock are, and ideally you're on horseback or maybe an ATV. You should probably not be drinking a beer in your truck at 2 in the afternoon on the edge of the allotment and claiming that you're range riding, which has been documented to happen specifically in Washington state. There's our other tools. There is fladry, which is literally just flagging. Wolves don't like things flapping. It's similar to if you all have fruit trees and you hang the kind of shiny streamers in it and the birds don't like it. Wolves don't like that either. But if you leave it out all winter, when your livestock's not there, they get used to it and it stops working. So like you need to use the tool well. It's like if I leave all my garden tools out all winter, they're pretty rusty in the spring and they don't really work anymore. Same thing with fladry. There are fox lights and There are solar panel electric fences that folks can take out, especially during calving and lambing season, so that you put a fence around and critters who come after them get zapped. There's also just livestock husbandry practices, like you should lime carcasses, you should remove them and compost them from the landscape. You definitely don't want to leave afterbirth out, because it's just incredibly attractive to a predator species. So there's all these things that you should be doing. There are some counties that have carcass composting facilities, but there's a lot of places in the state that don't. And so there's a big effort to provide more resources to that. There's a big federal grant where $3 million is coming in over the next 5 years from the federal government through the NRCS program to provide more tools to producers. But we're worried about whether that money's actually going to show up, given all of what's happening with federal funds being withdrawn. We can definitely talk about 777. Yeah, so I'm going to just go do a couple more slides, and then I'll make sure we have a few more questions. So educate yourself in your community. Christina's a huge resource locally, very knowledgeable about wolves. We've got another person here who is as well. Gently question that misinformation when you hear it. And then oppose bad wolf legislation. So Senate Bill 777 is our bad one that we're currently dealing with. And the Oregon State Legislature, the national level, is Lauren Boebert's delisting bill. Support those coexistence tools and funding for them. So what I will say is the coexistence program, the compensation program we have requires a minimum of 30% of those state tax dollars be spent on non-lethals. The really great news is that the percentage that's been allocated recently toward those coexistence tools is way higher. So in 2023, it was 84% of all requests were for coexistence tools, which is great, as long as they're being used well and they're the right ones in the right place. Because the worst outcome there is that they use one tool and it didn't work because either it was the wrong one, or they used it incorrectly, or they left it out too long, and then they say, oh, this coexistence stuff doesn't work. And folks stop believing and they tell their neighbors it doesn't work. That's worse than if they hadn't used the tools in the first place. So we advocate strenuously for folks to get good advice on the ground. So tomorrow night, there's a workshop outside of Bend for folks, because now there's wolf activity near Bend. So there's a workshop being put on by some of my colleagues to help tell folks and answer questions and get those tools into folks' hands so that they don't experience predation and there isn't that conflict. And then you can join nonprofits and follow the Pacific Wolf Coalition. We have a wolf family tree that tells you like the history of the packs in the state, and you can learn about the members of that coalition there. I can talk, I didn't do a slide on 777 because it's complicated, but I'll answer your question. So for several years, there's been a proposal to add a multiplier to the compensation plan. And the theory behind that from the ranchers is they claim that they've lost more than just the animal that was killed. They base that on a single study that is peer-reviewed, but that study, no non-lethal coexistence tools were in use. It was a very high conflict area with some pretty rugged terrain. And so these researchers went out, and this wasn't what they were looking at, but they noted that, oh man, we're finding like lots more wolf kills than the producers thought. And so the livestock interest has now said, well, this study means that for every wolf kill we find, there are 6 more, so a 7 multiplier. Most scientists do not agree with that outcome, and that's really not the premise of the study, but they've really like glommed onto that. And they claim that there's stress, and there are claims of lost weight. Now I would argue, like, you put an animal out on public lands or on, hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres with like native wildlife, it's kind of a natural thing that they might be moving around and not be putting on as much weight as if you just had them on like a concentrated animal feeding operation. But that's their premise. We've opposed that. Washington has a small multiplier. Colorado is part of the effort to get the reintroduction introduced to multiplier. So we've opposed that for many years. We support full compensation at full market value. That bill unfortunately passed out of the Senate and is now at the House. as of a couple hours ago. We think there's going to be a hearing a week from today, or a week from tomorrow on Wednesday. It's currently at a 5 multiplier. The original proposal was 7. They cut the conservation community entirely out of the conversation up the Senate side. And that was Senator Golden out of Ashland, like my hometown senator, and he just didn't speak to us at all. And he thought he made this great deal because he said, oh, we're going to get a minimum of 50% for non-lethals. And in theory, that's a good thing, except for that we're already well above 50% in practicality. So it's not an actual improvement in the program, and it doesn't improve the other flaws in the program. So one thing that's hard is that compensation program is in the Department of Agriculture, and then the actual management of wolves is in the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they don't really talk to each other. And ODF&W doesn't go confirm the non-lethals in use, so they've been very insistent, oh, the legislation says we confirm it, but the confirmation is a checkbox on the application. There's no on-the-ground confirmation. So we have asked for amendments, and also the livestock loss boards are county volunteer committees, and they meet like once a year. And that is tricky, and there's competition for limited funds. So we have proposed that there should be a statewide livestock loss board with criteria that are applied equally across the board, and where they consider all applications from all the counties. We started out with 8 counties with livestock loss boards, now we have 18, and there will probably be more. We've asked for a reduction in the multiplier, and we've also asked for restoration of the anti-poaching money, because unfortunately that got cut from ODF&W's budget and the governor's budget to the tune of over almost, let's see, what is it? It's just shy of $700,000 to ODF&W and shy of $700,000 to Oregon State Police. It's the whole anti-poaching program. It's gone from the budget. So we've been advocating for them to restore it to the budget for the agency and in the governor's budget, and we've also been advocating for that to get added to this bill so that we get the money back. They've also asked for $2 million of general fund so that they can pay for this multiplier. And I'll tell you what I think the worst outcome is that the multiplier passes, but the funding bill doesn't, because they're in separate bills, and there is enormous competition this year for state funds, and there's an extreme amount of concern that if Medicaid funds are withheld from Oregon, which has very high Medicaid uptake, that we won't be able to pay for anything because there'll be a mad dash to backfill Medicaid. So that the assessment I've heard is maybe 60% of the state budget we'd be able to fill if we don't get federal Medicaid dollars. So there's a lot of concern about that. So they've asked for that money, but it's going to be really hard to get $2 million from the Ways and Means Committee. And then what happens is they set it up so it's first come, first serve. So say Wallowa County, they get to decide how high of a multiplier up to 5 they apply. They get some applications, they apply that, and they drain the fund. And then all the other folks that apply, there's no more money. And I think that's going to lead to some very bad outcomes for wolves. So I'm very concerned. We'll be sending out an action alert in the next couple days. We just definitely encourage you to call your elected officials and oppose that bill. Ask them to consider the amendments that we've proposed. But it's definitely worrisome. And there's definitely a lot of misinformation in Salem about that. Whether ODF&W does confirmation. So ODF&W confirms wolf kills if there's a request for a kill permit or as a request for an investigation. But they do not go out and look and see whether the non-lethals are being correctly used that are part of the Oregon Department of Agriculture compensation program. So yeah, they still do that, or sometimes it's contracted to Wildlife Services, but the programs are divorced and they don't really talk to each other. So we've written an amendment to try to fix that moving forward. So I'm at time, but I'm happy to take any more questions you all might have, and thank you so much for your interest this evening.